Shalom, shalom, brothers and sisters. Shalom, shalom. Welcome back to the channel. Welcome back to Trumpet's Call. I'm AmarYaH. I pray that you are holding on to faith, amunah, and holding on to hope, tekuah, during these times. Thank you so much for joining me once again on the channel and for another session of our studies in Isaiah. Today's session of our studies in Isaiah finds us in Isaiah or Yeshayahu chapter 63. And this chapter talks about the judgment of Jacob's brother, Esau or Edom. In order for us to fully read this chapter and to break it down under Yahuwah's power with understanding, we've got to provide a little backstory on the justification and the reason why there is a need to bring judgment on Esau, Edom, as described in Yeshayahu chapter 63 and in Obadiah or AmarYaH chapter 1. So before we get to Yeshayahu chapter 63, we're going to provide a little backstory that will give you a better understanding of just some of the things that Abba may be looking at as he is issuing forth judgment on Esau, Edom. Okay? So we're going to begin with slavery. Okay. Now there are many things I could have included before, going right to slavery. I could have talked about how Esau was very happy when Babylonians came and defeated our ancestors, and they wanted them to raze it to the ground, to destroy the city of Jerusalem. They were happy about the destruction that was coming to our city, our way of life. And I could have talked about how when we came out of Egypt, Egyptian bondage, Esau would not allow us passage through his territory. And it created a situation where we had to go the long way around because they would not allow us to pass over their land, even if we paid them and promised not to damage any of their grass or eat any of their livestock. They just did not want that to happen. I also could have mentioned the influx of Edomites in leadership in the southern kingdom and how they made decisions that weren't exactly in Jacob's best interest, but that enriched themselves and benefited themselves. And so there are a number of things that I could have discussed as a precursor to explaining just why this judgment is coming upon the nation of Esau, Edom. But I'm going to begin with slavery because that's really pivotal. And I think that when you look at the role that they played in slavery, our enslavement, and our continued subjugation, I think you'll see why Abba is making the judgments that he's making, at least in part, okay? So on the screen here, you see an image of our ancestors, Jacob's sons and his daughters, being chained like animals, hands tied behind their backs, and being marched onto cargo ships, not passenger ships, cargo ships. There's cargo in the hold, and these men of Zion are going to become additional cargo for the triangular trade in which goods are brought out of Europe and then traded with those on the continent whose job it was to capture those of the Yahudim and prepare them for the slave trade, prepare them for months on a boat to be taken into captivity and to be sold like chattel. So the Europeans came to the continent of Africa and they traded the goods that they had in their hold for slaves. They put the slaves in the hold and then they triangulated over to the quote-unquote New World, either South America or North America, and traded the slaves for goods that they had there, either sugar or rum or whatever it was that they were interested in, cotton, what have you. And then when they got those goods, they would go back to Europe and start it all over again. And so they called this the triangular trade. You would think that they would just trade with those in North America and South America and just leave us out of that triangulation. But it was Abba's will that this happened to us, and that's why it happened. We were paying the penalty for our sin. And Abba had declared desolations unto us, and desolations we experienced. So slavery. Once the now precious cargo reaches its destination, then there would be a slave auction, and young girls, young boys, men and women, and even babies were sold on the auction block to the highest bidder. Their lives and their fates no longer their own. They now have become the possession of another. On the screen you see an advertisement for a sale auction. It says, on Wednesday the 30th at 12 o'clock at the Planters Hotel, we will sell the parties concerned 17 valuable slaves consisting of men, women, and children, some very likely. Also, one likely boy, about 17 years of age, sale positive, and then it gives the information for where this sale will take place. And then it talks about the steamer Virginia that's about to leave Baltimore on Friday for Christmas and will return on the 29th of December, making her last trip for the season to go get more slaves to sell. And we see here an image on the screen of slaves being auctioned off and a woman begging and pleading for her children. It looks like in this image, her children have been sold out from under her, and they go one direction and she goes another, and she's pleading for them to be able to stay together. That happened a lot, far too often. Families were broken up and split apart. And so we're going to be talking about the transatlantic slave trade. And by no means by talking about the transatlantic am I ignoring the Arab Muslim slave trade that was just as bad, if not worse, and lasted longer than the transatlantic slave trade. But I'm going to focus my attention on the transatlantic slave trade briefly as I provide justification for the judgment that is to come. And so on this screen, you'll see a map of the focus of where the slaves were taken during the transatlantic and the Muslim Arab slave trade. Most of the slaves that were captured on the east coast of Africa and southern Africa were taken into Asia. And then those on the west coast of Africa were taken to North America, South America, and then some even into Europe and enslaved there. So we're going to be reading this article from World History Encyclopedia concerning the transatlantic slave trade, and it's entitled Transatlantic Slave Trade, the Shame of Nations. The transatlantic slave trade, circa 1492 to 1860, was the practice of enslaving the citizens of African states and transporting them across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World of the Americas. Although the Portuguese were the first to initiate the slave trade between Africa and Europe in the 15th century, Christopher Columbus, sailing for Spain, was the first to export slaves from the Americas across the Atlantic to Europe, and so is generally considered to have established the transatlantic slave trade, as that term is usually understood in 1492. And here you'll see an image on the screen of, once again, the routes, the many routes of where slaves were being trafficked in all directions. From all over the continent, you had ships sailing from West Africa, East Africa, and South Africa, and taking human beings into captive bondage. The doctrine of discovery, issued by Pope Alexander VI in 1493, proclaimed the right of any Christian nation to take the land of non-Christians in the interest of saving their souls. That same year, the Pope declared that non-Christian inhabitants of those lands could be enslaved for the same purpose. Slavery had long been established in Africa prior to the arrival of Europeans, so the apparatus for capturing and transporting human cargo was already in place. Now, keep in mind that the Africans that had been transporting slaves were likely not Hebrew. Just because a person has a black face and lives on the continent of Africa doesn't make them a Hebrew. There were many groups of people and many tribes on the continent. So in addition to the Shemites, you had many different types of people on the continent. And those who weren't of our people were the ones who were capturing and trafficking slaves and selling them for them to be trafficked all over the world. Portugal began exporting slaves from Africa to Europe in 1440, and by 1530, other European nations had become involved. In time, this practice included the triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas, with ships leaving European ports with goods, trading them in Africa for slaves, selling the slaves in the Americas, and returning to their home ports with American goods and raw materials. Between 12 million and 18 million Africans of diverse nations were turned into cargo by the transatlantic slave trade. Here's an image on the screen of these cargo ships. You can see the cargo in the very bottom of the cargo hold, and then you see slaves on the middle passage or the middle area of the cargo hold as they're being transported, and then you see slaves on the deck and also crewmen on the deck. It reads slave ship model, which shows a typical ship in the early 1700s on the middle passage. To preserve their profits, captains and sailors tried to limit the deaths of slaves from disease, suicide, and revolt. In the grisly arithmetic of the slave trade, captains usually chose between two options: pack in as many slaves as possible and hope that most survive, or put fewer aboard, improve the conditions between decks, and hope to lose fewer to disease. In Chapter 2 of his 1789 work, YAHUAH Equiano gives a first-hand account of the conditions of his circa 1755 enslavement and passage aboard a slave ship. The stench of the hold, while we were on the coast, was so intolerably loathsome that it was dangerous to remain there for any time, and some of us had been permitted to stay on the deck for the fresh air. But now that the whole ship's cargo were confined together, it became absolutely pestilential. The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us. This produced copious perspirations, so that the air soon became unfit for respiration, from a variety of loathsome smells, and brought on a sickness among the slaves, of which many died, thus falling victim to the improvident avarice, as I may call it, of their purchasers. This wretched situation was again aggravated by the galling of the chains, now become insupportable, and the filth of the necessary tubs, into which the children often fell, and were almost suffocated. The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole scene of horror almost inconceivable. A description of the conditions on the slave ships as reported by a first-hand account of YAHUAH Equiano in his book. Continuing. Slavery was first institutionalized in the 13 colonies that would become the United States in 1640 at Jamestown Colony of Virginia, and afterwards benefited significantly from the transatlantic slave trade until it was abolished in 1808, although the practice continued for decades afterwards. So this is the abolition of the slave trade on paper, but in reality, it looked a little different. Continuing. Abolition did not mean the end of the practice, however, as slave traders continued to illegally smuggle human cargo across the Atlantic. The last slave ship to transport kidnapped Africans to the United States was the Clotilda in 1860. Domestic traffic in slaves continued in the United States, briefly interrupted by the American Civil War, until slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment in 1865. Evidence suggests, however, that the transatlantic slave trade may have continued illegally through 1873. So we've had a brief description of slavery. This is a description in very brief, okay? So you've learned about the triangular trade, the transatlantic slave trade. You've learned about the ways in which the ships were taking our ancestors from the continent of Africa to other continents and selling them into a lifetime of servitude. So on the screen you see an image of two babies, one Jacob and one Esau. And it reads, "And YAHUAH said unto her, Two nations are in thy womb, and two manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels, and one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger." Now the elder serving the younger, it happened for a bit as we read through the Tanakh, but for the most part the dominance, the long-term dominance of Jacob would not be seen until later. So right now we see the younger serving the elder. And this is what we see in slavery. We see the younger serving the elder. Two brothers. We're going to read some verses of scripture about Jacob and Esau, and then we're going to read some passages about slavery and how slaves are to be treated according to Torah. Bereshith, Genesis chapter 25. Later, Yitzhak, Isaac, prayed to YAHUAH on behalf of his wife, because she was barren. And YAHUAH heard his prayer, and his wife Rebekah, conceived. But the children inside her struggled with each other, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So Rebekah went to inquire of YAHUAH, and he declared to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." And as I said, right now we see the younger serving the older, but that will change. Continuing, Bereshith 25, 21 through 26. When her time came to give birth, there were indeed twins in her womb, and the first one came out red, covered with hair like a fur coat, so they named him Esau. After this, his brother came out, grasping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob, or Jacob. And Yitzhak, Isaac, was 60 years old when the twins were born. Devarim, chapter 23, verse 7. You shall not abhor, and that word means to detest, loathe, or treat abominably an Edomite, for he is your brother or your relative. You shall not abhor an Egyptian, because you were an alien or a stranger in his land. What we see here is that Jacob and Esau were brothers. They're relatives. They're brothers. They look different. Jacob looks like your standard Hebrew, the way many of us look today, pretty dark skin. But Esau, or Esau, he had reddish skin. He had a reddish tint to his skin. Do I believe he was white? No, I don't believe he was white. But I do believe that he was lighter skinned than Jacob. Because if you recall, Rebekah's brother, Laban means white. Why would they give Laban the name white if his skin weren't light colored? So it could be within the family line there had been some mixing somehow, and that got into the DNA that produced Jacob and Esau. These genetic differences expressing themselves more vigorously in Esau than in Jacob. But we see him having a lighter colored skin, I believe, and very hairy. So we know that they're brothers. We know that they look different from one another. We also see in Devarim that the instruction from Abba is instructing Jacob and his children to not abhor an Edomite. And so you would think that it would go both ways, that the Edomites were then not to abhor those of Jacob. Okay? What's good for one is good for the other. In Shemuth chapter 21 we read, Now these are the rules that you shall set before them. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go free for nothing. So the scripture is telling us how Hebrew slaves, if they find themselves in the position of being slaves, how they are to be treated, particularly by people who are relatives. And we know that Esau is a relative, okay? Let's continue. So the slave is to be set free for nothing, no cost. There should be no cost to redeem himself or purchase himself out of slavery. On the 7th year, he shall go free. If he comes in single, he shall go out single, meaning unmarried. But if he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons and daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's property, and he shall go out alone. But if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him to the judges, or the Elohim, and he shall bring him to the door, or the doorpost. And the master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall be his slave forever. Okay? So notice that perpetual servitude, or a lifetime of slavery and bondage, is the slave's choice. It's the slave's choice. It's not something that's been foisted upon him. He gets to choose whether or not he wants to be a slave forever. Continuing. Shemot chapter 21. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do, meaning go out to freedom and become free, be set free. If she does not please her master, who has designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed, meaning be purchased by one of her family members, so that she's no longer a slave. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people. Hear that. The scripture is saying that the person who has a slave, who is a female, has no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he will have broken faith with her. Okay? He should give her an opportunity to be redeemed by her relatives and not sell her off to a stranger. This is Torah. If he designates her for his son, meaning in marriage, he shall deal with her as a daughter, not as a slave. So if the slave owner's son has relations with this woman who has been a slave, suddenly she's not a slave anymore. She's to be treated as a member of the family, as a daughter. This is Torah. Okay? Make note of these things, because when you look at the things that are happening in slavery, you can see how unjust these situations were. If he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. And if he does not do these 3 things for her, she shall go out for nothing without payment or money. So if she's not treated well, if she doesn't have her clothing, her marital rights, and if she is not treated as a daughter, she is to leave the slave situation, this potential slave situation, as a free person without the need to be redeemed. That's Torah. He continues, whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. If someone steals a person from, let's say, off their continent, and then sells them, any person who has that person that's been sold in their possession shall be put to death. That's Torah. So the Most High is taking names. He sees who has been in the possession of someone who has been sold. Abba sees. When a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. The slave shall be avenged. But if the slave survives a day or 2, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. When a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free because of his eye. If he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let the slave go because of his tooth. Okay? So to harm a slave in any particular way means the setting free of that slave. So just take note, because our ancestors experienced great cruelty and great horror, and yet Torah was not abided by. It was not. It was ignored. Urakra, Leviticus chapter 25. As for your male and female slaves, whom you may have, you may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are around you, and you may also buy from among the strangers who sojourn with you, and their clans that are with you. who have been born in your land, and they may be your property. So these are instructions from the Most High to Hebrews regarding who they may enslave. They may enslave or purchase those who are for sale around them, meaning on the continent of Africa. You may bequeath them to your sons after you to inherit as a possession forever. You may make slaves of men, but over your brothers, the people of Yasharal, you shall not rule one over another ruthlessly. Instructions from the Most High that Hebrews are not to own Hebrews. Deuteronomy chapter 23. You shall not give up to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall dwell with you in your midst, in the place where he shall choose within one of your towns. Wherever it suits him, you shall not wrong him. So if someone who has been a slave escaped, let's say from a slave state to a free state, Torah says that you are not to give that slave back to his master. You're to allow that slave to live with you. So if you're living, abiding by Torah, you would have to justify any actions that were contrary to the things that we're reading regarding how to treat slaves, Hebrew or otherwise. So we're going to continue on with this article entitled Memento Mori and the Dutch and Ish Involvement in Transatlantic Slavery. Why is this important? This is important because if indeed Ish is involved in the transatlantic slave trade, they have an obligation and a responsibility to act in accordance with Torah. And so we should have been treated in a certain way in accordance with Torah. Okay? And we know it didn't happen. So let's read this article. Transatlantic Slavery and the Dutch and Ish Involvement. The Atlantic slave trade that took place from the 16th to the 19th century transported about 12 million on up to 18 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to North and South America. This makes it the biggest forced migration in history. The majority of enslaved people were sold by Africans from central and western parts of Africa to European slave traders who shipped them to the New World. The main European trading countries were Portugal, the United Kingdom, France, Spain, and the Netherlands. The Most High sees who were prominent in the slave trade, and he will judge. The Dutch first participated in transatlantic slavery in the 1630s by transporting slaves to Brazil. Following that, the Netherlands also got involved in the trade to the Spanish colonies. In the 18th century, the country's most important slavery markets were what are today Suriname and Guyana. Initially, the Dutch trade was organized by the so-called Dutch West Indies Company, but after 1730, an era of free trade developed. The Dutch part in transatlantic slavery is estimated at 5 to 7%. This means that about 550,000 to 600,000 Africans were deported by the Netherlands. Dutch Orthodox Rabbi Lodi van de Kamp wrote in a book about Dutch-ish complicity in the transatlantic slave trade. He talks about the Jodensavan, Ish Savannah, an agricultural community with 40-ish owned plantations with at least 5,000 enslaved people and a part of former Dutch Guyana. Seymour Drescher, a historian at the University of Pittsburgh, states that Dutch fill-in-the-blank may have accounted for the resale of at least 15,000 enslaved people in the Caribbean island of Curaçao. According to Drescher, there was a time when Ish people controlled about 17% of the Caribbean trade in Dutch colonies. However, Ish involvement in transatlantic slavery is not unique, as wealthy merchants across Europe of different faiths all participated. This was an equal opportunity sin, and many engaged. So read the title here. The people listed on the screen owned and operated the African slave trade. Very few white people owned slaves. Slavery was a rich man's pursuit, and slavery did not exist among the middle and working classes of white people. European whites did not bring the slaves to America. On the contrary, it was and it's spelled out for you, who brought them, as Louis Farrakhan has also pointed out. Below is a listing of the Ish slave ships and the Ish owners of them. The Abigail was owned by Aaron Lopez, Moses Levy, and Jacob Frank. The Crown was owned by Isaac Levy and Nathan Simpson. The Nassau and Four Sisters were both owned by Moses Levy, or Levy. Anne and Eliza owned the Justice Bosch and John Adams. Prudent Betty owned by Henry Kruger and Jacob Phoenix. The Hessler and the Elizabeth were both owned by Mordecai and David Gomez. Antigua, owned by Nathan Marston and Abram Lyle. Betsy, owned by William DeWolf. Polly, owned by James DeWolf. White Horse, owned by Jan de Sweet. Expedition, owned by John and Jacob Roosevelt. Charlotte, owned by Moses and Sam Levy and Jacob Franks. The Caracoa, owned by Moses and Sam Levy. And you'll see the source is Elizabeth Donnan, Volumes 4, Documents Illustrative of the History of the Slave Trade to America. And that is the source of this information. We'll now take a look at a short video that describes just who was involved in the transporting of slaves across the Atlantic and into the Americas. Take a look.
This is going to blow your mind. Ashkenazi Jews in the transatlantic slave trade? Yep, it happened. Let's talk about it. During the transatlantic slave trade, Ashkenazi Jewish merchants, alongside other European powers, were involved in owning and trading enslaved people from West Africa. We're talking about enslaving people believed to be part of the biblical House of Judah. Some notable names? Aaron Lopez and Isaac da Costa, both Portuguese Ashkenazi Jews, as well as the Gradillas and Lopezes from the British Ashkenazi Jewish communities. This history is deep and complex, recognizing both the victimhood and agency of the enslaved, and the roles of various groups, including Ashkenazi Jewish merchants.
As you can see from the video that we just watched, it has been documented in the records who owned the slave ships that transported our ancestors into their enslavement. And not only, more often than not, did they own the slave ships, they also were the primary purchasers of said slaves. I will read a document to you later that indicates that when auctions for slaves were held on feast days and on weekly Sabbaths, they were postponed or rescheduled in honor of those feast days. Why? Because the Ish people were the major purchasers of our people. And this is why Abba will judge them so harshly, because they have had a long-standing hatred for Jacob, for Yaakov. And they have demonstrated that hatred throughout all time. Let's continue. We're going to look at some additional ships. Now, I'm not going to name all of them because there are many here, but there is no doubt that we find Ish people involved in the slave trade as they owned the ships. They were involved in the transport of slaves from the African continent to the Americas. Now, will we find them actually owning slaves on plantations? Yes, we will. I'm going to allow you to pause as you see fit and read over the names of these slave ships. We're going to continue on. This article is from Haaretz, which is an article out of Israel, and it is entitled The Uncomfortable Truths About Ish Life in the U.S. South. A New Orleans museum that opened last month sheds light on surprising aspects of Ish life in the 13 southern states since the mid-1700s. An advertisement in North Carolina's Wilmington Journal in 1847 reveals a stain on local-ish history. Ainsley Davis, who came from Petersburg, Virginia, published the ad under the heading Negroes Wanted. The text stated, "I wish to purchase a large number of Negroes of both genders, from the ages of 14 to 30, for which I will pay the highest cash price." Davis, whose family owned one of the largest ish-run slave trading companies in the entire South, would tour the region every summer seeking new slaves, which he later sold. Davis was not the only Southern fill-in-the-blank who made a living in the slave trade prior to the Civil War. David Wise of New Orleans also put up slaves for sale at the time, working out of a depot on the city's Barron Street. He always has a large number of slaves which will be sold for cash, according to an ad that he placed in a paper. A fine lot of young, likely able-bodied Negroes, girls and men, excellent field hands. By the time the war broke out, New Orleans was the largest slave trading city in the South. And here we see to the right an ad, Negroes Wanted. Okay, so this is the ad that we read earlier. This is the way it would have looked in the paper at that time. Continuing. Southern fill-in-the-blanks owned slaves in comparable numbers to their white non-ish neighbors. A few were active slave traders. Such facts have been used and widely exaggerated by anti-Semites, but are among the uncomfortable truths of Southern-ish history. Now, this article was written by an ish person, and of course there is an attempt here to justify what happened and to downplay what happened and to call any attempts to bring truth that A word that they use all too often. And so this is happening here as this person is writing this article. But you can't deny the facts, okay? You can try to hide them and you can try to change them, but you can't deny them. Not with a straight face, that is. Continuing. Here's an ad that was placed in a paper from David Wise, definitely an ish name, and it reads, Slave Depot, Barron Street, New Orleans, has always on hand a large number of slaves which will be sold low for cash or city paper. Just arrived from Owensburg, Kentucky, a fine lot of young, likely and able-bodied Negroes, both girls and men, 90 in number, and excellent field hands, which will sell on accommodating terms. And there it is, yet another ad advocating for the sale of human beings. Continuing. In an effort to show other sides of the coin of ish history in the South, MSJE, whose staff also engages in research, tells the story of fill-in-the-blank who attained high offices in many cities throughout that region. According to data the museum collected, there have been some 200-ish mayors of southern locales. The first was Mordecai de Leon, who was appointed mayor of Columbia, South Carolina in 1833. Some cities had more than one ish mayor. Georgetown, South Carolina, held the record with no fewer than 7 ish mayors. Selma, Alabama, and El Paso, Texas, had a number of ish mayors. If you think about the treatment of our people, those people who are in charge, who are mayors or governors, they're complicit in how our people were treated. And if they're ish, that says a lot. It really does. Continuing. One of the fill-in-the-blanks who held office in the South was Judah Benjamin, who was appointed the Confederacy's Secretary of War and Secretary of State in 1861, according to the museum. More than 2,000 fill-in-the-blank fought in the Civil War on the Confederate side. In my research, I found that as high as 6,000 to 9,000 of the ish served on the Confederate side of the war. Now, it remains to be seen why that would be, but it seems an obvious explanation would be that you're wanting to protect your interest And if you're wanting to protect your interest, slavery must persist, right? So you would fight on the side of the Confederates. Continuing. This article is entitled, "The First-ish Senators Were Slave Owners. How should we reckon with their legacy?" This article talks about two prominent slave owners who were members of Congress, and their names were David Levy Yulee and Judah P. Benjamin. They were enslavers, and they were ish. We will read a portion of this article in which the degree to which they owned slaves and the prominence they had and the wealth that they gained from slavery will be discussed. Yulee and Benjamin's history of enslaving has long been well known. Yulee and Benjamin's history isn't a surprise, and Michael Hoberman, an English studies professor at Fitchburg State University, who is currently writing a book about how early American-ish history is remembered today. But he said it's a reminder that many Southern, fill-in-the-blank, owned slaves, just like any other wealthy Southern family did. The majority of Southern fill-in-the-blanks owned enslaved people, mostly in their homes. A few, like Benjamin, who served as a senator from Louisiana between 1853 and 1861, ran plantations that exploited the labor of enslaved people. Benjamin, who operated a 300-acre sugarcane plantation, owned at one point as many as 140 enslaved people. Yulee, who was the first-ish senator, represented Florida from 1845 to 1851 to 1855 to 1861, and over the course of his life enslaved more than 1,000 people. He was known as the Florida Fire Eater, the latter term referring to pro-slavery Democrats who supported secession before the Civil War. And so, right now we're getting into a part of this article where we're talking about those people who practiced Judaism and yet did not live by it. These two men were very wealthy. They had amassed a fortune for themselves on the backs of black and brown slaves. And I find it very hard to believe that they would not have known who the true people are, then and now. Anyone reading the scriptures would know that eventually something would happen to Jacob, something would happen to Yaakov and his descendants, and eventually he would end up desolate and in a bad way. It seems to me that Esau, Edom, and his descendants were just biding their time, waiting for their opportunity to pounce on Yaakov when he was at his lowest. The fact that so many of the slave ships were owned by Ish people, and so many of the enslavers were Ish, and so many of the plantations were, it's mind-boggling, to be honest. I became shocked when I realized that the majority of those who were purchasing us were them. And as they are prone to do, they rewrite the history to benefit themselves. So they've made it seem as if you have Aryans who in large part were owning us when it was them. But we're not done for today. We're now going to watch a portion of an interview by Rabbi Shmuley Yankovich as he interviews Professor Stan Mirvis, who has done some extensive research looking at the inheritance records of those Ish people who owned slaves in the Americas and in the Caribbean. And so what he has determined gives us an even better idea of how the Ish people related to the slaves that they now own. Take a look.
Pleasure to be here with Professor Stan Mirvis at ASU, who is just coming out with a book this coming spring, 2020.
That's right.
On Jews of 18th century Jamaica, published by Yale University Press. So very exciting. Can you tell us a little bit about why you chose to write this?
So I've been spending the last several years reading wills and trying to reconstruct the history of a whole community based on just those documents.
Wow. So if you ask the average American Jew how many Jews ever lived in Jamaica, they'd say just a few vacationers for vacation. So what's the truth about that?
Well, that's not inaccurate today.
Yeah.
And today there are about 200
Right.
Jews in Jamaica, which actually makes it quite a large Caribbean community. And the community today is made up of an old guard of Portuguese, and there's a lot of Israelis there, and also a lot of people of color who are connected to the community either by having a heritage of having been Jewish or descended from a Jewish person, or they are attracted to Judaism. So that's the makeup of the community today. In the 18th century, the community reached a peak at around 1,000, which still doesn't seem like a lot. And it was actually smaller than other Caribbean communities. So Curacao and Suriname all had larger Jewish populations in the 18th century. Those were Dutch colonies. But Jamaica alone was bigger than all North America put together.
What is the dynamic in play with Jews and slavery in Jamaica?
Yeah, so this is obviously a huge aspect of what I write about, and the reason I write about this so much is because it was a very conspicuous aspect of the wills.
Yeah.
As I was reading the wills,
wow.
you find that that slave populations are being bequeathed en masse, and in that they're being named individually, and also you see a lot of evidence, sometimes very direct and articulate, of concubinage or relationships, sexual relationships with women of color, both enslaved and free, and then incorporating their children to some extent into the family through voluntary inheritance. So that all made me realize that we need to address the issue of Jewish slave ownership. So in fact, I crunched the numbers in my wills, and I found that slaves were about 11 times more likely to be bequeathed than they were to be freed by Jews. So it's very uncommon to actually free manumit slaves. And there are cases of Jewish abuse of slaves. And then there are plenty of cases of manumissions. In one case, he manumits a Jewish slave owner manumits his quote-unquote mulatto son because of the love and affection he has for him. So there are cases of sort of sentimentality as well. But Jews are like everybody else.
Right.
There are some abusive slave owners, and there are some that own slaves because that's what's done in the colony that they live in. Especially focused on Suriname, where Jews had a whole plantation community of their own, autonomous Jewish plantation village called Yoden Savannah, where they enslaved thousands of Africans. So there's been a lot of new research, and I think where we are writ large is that the Jews show no particularity in their slave ownership than anybody else. And that's true in the American South as well. And there were, proportionally to the numbers, because there were more Jews living in the North at the time of the Civil War, but proportionately there was as much support for the Southern cause among Jews as there were for as there was for the cause of the North. And ironically, the rabbinate was quite split on the issue of emancipation of slaves. And so in one case, Morris Raphael in New York wrote a very famous piece, an editorial, where he defended slavery because, after all, the Bible endorses slavery, and the Bible actually sets out very clear parameters by which a Jew should own slaves, or how a Jew should own slaves.
Of course, there were Jews of color in Jamaica, and so how does the Jewish community in Jamaica, particularly Jewish slave owners, relate to Jews of color? Are they primarily Jews? Are they primarily people of color? Did Jewish white folks own Jewish people of color? So what did all that look like? Being Jewish wouldn't have been any street cred to avoid slavery, though, right?
You mean to avoid being enslaved?
Enslaved, yeah.
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
Right, not necessarily.
After watching this interview, it becomes clear that Ish people did own slaves in the Americas and in the Caribbean. They did benefit financially. The interviewer and the interviewee did not want to go out on a limb and indicate that they owned slaves more than anyone else. And based on the interview, we can see that there was no move to manumit or to liberate those slaves after the slave owner passed. So in their wills, they would not, for the most part, set any of the slaves free. One or two or three here or there. But for the most part, they perpetuated the enslavement and the ownership of people who had their blood, who practiced the same faith, at least in part, that they did. We also saw in the interview that there are some Ish men who had had relations with slaves and free women of color, and yet it did not determine that they would then treat that woman as a daughter of Zion, as a wife, as scripture indicates. So we see a double standard. As we read in the Jewish Encyclopedia, I will read the highlighted portions. It says, during the 17th century, the sugar industry was monopolized by the Jays. Monopolized. Skipping down, it says, in fact, the cotton plantations in many parts of the South were wholly, that means completely, in the hands of the Jays. And as a consequence, slavery found its advocates among them. Certain people were so advantaged by slavery that they did not desire for it to end ever, because it was a gravy train for them. And to boot, there was such an intense hatred of them for us that would be another reason why they would not want slavery to end. Here's another bit of information on the screen. And what you're seeing here is a list of major-ish cotton dealers in the South, in the Jim Crow South. Now, I encourage you to pause this video and take a look at this map, because you're not going to be able to see everything you need to see here. But I wanted to post it in its entirety, and it makes it small. But if you'll notice, there are many, many-ish cotton farms that dot the South. And this shows that there is a wholesale domination of this market, of the cotton market, the sugar market, the rum market, so on and so forth. So you can see how certain people are overly represented within the slave trade and within the profit-making structure as a result of owning slaves and profiting off of them. Okay? What you see is ownership of the cotton plantations in Mississippi and Alabama and New Orleans and Galveston, Texas, and there are many of them. So I encourage you to pause this and take a look at this map at your leisure. What you see on the screen now is an article that is found in Haaretz, which is an Israeli newspaper, and it's entitled, "The Israeli Who Dared Write a Novel About Jews and African Slave Trade." And then I have taken a snippet from the article, as I will not be reading it in its entirety. It says, "Yes, it's true. My great-great-grandfather's grandfather was a slave trader. Agur Skiff's latest book features an Israeli man with the same name as his, traveling to Africa and standing trial for being the descendant of a slave trafficker. The author explains why this story needed to be told." I applaud anyone who would stand and take decisive action and give an account for not only their ancestors' actions, but their own. We're now going to read this article that I found on Scribd. And so here's a snippet from this article. And it reads, "The following passages are from Dr. Raphael's book, Jays and Judaism in the United States, a documentary history. Jays also took an active part in the Dutch colonial slave trade. Indeed, the bylaws of the Recife and the Mauricia congregations included an imposta-ish tax of 5 soldas for each Negro slave, a Brazilian Jay, purchased from the West Indies Company. Slave auctions were postponed if they fell on an Ish holiday. In Curaçao in the 17th century, as well as in the British colonies of Barbados and Jamaica in the 18th century, Ish merchants played a major role, not minor, major, in the slave trade. In fact, in all the American colonies, whether French, Martinique, British, or Dutch, Ish merchants frequently dominated. This is no less true on the North American mainland, where during the 18th century, Jays participated in the triangular trade that brought slaves from Africa to the West Indies, and they exchanged them for molasses, which was in turn taken to New England and converted into rum for sale in Africa. Isn't that ironic? You steal the people from the continent of Africa, you enslave them in the new land, you use their labor to grow the sugar cane, to then turn that sugar cane into rum, to take the cursed drink back to the continent so the people there can drink it and be affected negatively by alcoholism due to the rum. It's just mind-boggling. It's absolutely mind-boggling. Isaac DaCosta of Charleston in the 1750s, David Franks of Philadelphia in the 1760s, and Aaron Lopez of Newport in the late 1760s and early 1770s dominated Ish slave trading on the American continent. Dr. Raphael discusses the central role of the Jays in the New World commerce and the African slave trade, and we find this information on pages 23 through 25 of this book. Continuing. Groups of Jays began to arrive in Suriname in the middle of the 17th century after the Portuguese regained control of northern Brazil. By 1794, 27 years after the British had surrendered Suriname to the Dutch, there were about 100-ish families and 50 single Jays there, or about 570 persons. They possessed more than 40 estates and 9,000 slaves, contributed 25,905 pounds of sugar as a gift for the building of a hospital, and carried on an active trade with Newport and other colonial ports. By 1730, Jays owned 115 plantations and were a large part of a sugar export business which sent out 21,680,000 pounds of sugar to European and New World markets in 1730 alone. Slave trading was a major feature of Ish economic life in Suriname and was a major stopping-off point in the triangular trade. Both North American and Caribbean Jays played a key role in this commerce. Records of a slave sale in 1707 revealed that the 10 largest Ish purchasers, 10,400 guilders, spent more than 25% of the total funds exchanged. Continuing. Ish economic life in the Dutch West Indies, as in the North American colonies, consisted primarily of mercantile communities and the distribution of wealth. Most Jays were shopkeepers, middlemen, or petty merchants who received encouragement and support from Dutch authorities. In Curaçao, for example, Ish communal life began after the Portuguese victory in 1654. In 1656, the community founded a congregation, and in the early 1670s brought its first rabbi to the island. Curaçao, with its large natural harbor, was the stepping stone to the other Caribbean islands, and thus ideally suited geographically for commerce. The Jays were the recipients of favorable charters containing generous economic privileges granted by the Dutch West Indies Company in Amsterdam. The economic life of the Ish community of Curaçao revolved around ownership of sugar plantations and marketing of sugar and importing of manufactured goods, and a heavy involvement in the slave trade. Within a decade of their arrival, Jays owned 80% of the Curaçao plantations. The strength of the Ish trade lay in connections in Western Europe, as well as ownership of the ships used in commerce. While Jays carried on an active trade with France and English colonies in the Caribbean, their principal market was the Spanish Main, today Venezuela and Colombia. And as I said before, this article is available at the location on the bottom of the screen. The Most High sees it all, and he sees how there has been a wholesale takeover of his people by a particular group of people, being involved in every aspect of our defilement, of our punishment, of our desolations, and our failure to rise above our current circumstances. We're being held down so that they can continue to rise. But the Most High, who sees all, knows all, and will judge all, is about to burst some balloons. He's about to burst some bubbles, and some people who are destined for a great fall will fall. And the Most High will cause his people, YAHUAH, to rise. And so, as you have seen, based on just this article alone, there has been a heavy presence of the Ish people in the slave trade, from Europe to Africa to the New World. There has been a heavy involvement and a heavy gaining of wealth on the backs of their brother, Jacob. Won't Yahuwah judge? He will indeed. And now finally, let's go to Scripture. So now that we've laid a framework for the ways in which those who call themselves the promised people, the people of the Most High YAHUAH, and how they comported themselves during the time of slavery and how they profited off for the enslavement of their brother, this is a major reason that the Father has determined judgments and wrath upon the nation of Esau, Edom. YAHUAH, chapter 63. Who is this that cometh from Edom with dyed garments from Bosra? Bosra is an Edomite fortified city. This that is glorious in his apparel, traveling in the greatness of his strength. I that speak in righteousness, mighty to save. Wherefore art thou red in thine apparel, and thy garments like him that treadeth in the wine fat? I have trodden the winepress alone, and of the people there was none with me, for I will tread them in mine anger and trample them in my fury. So we begin this passage in YAHUAH, chapter 63, with wrath and with judgment on Bosra, a fortified city within the territory of Edom. And the Most High is very clearly indicating a judgment on this Edomite city and on the Edomites. He says he's the one doing the judging. Now, he may do it through his son, but this is Abba's work, and he will not rest until it's been done. His garment is red in the blood of grapes as he treads the winepress alone, as he takes those from particular nations and throws them into the treader, where he treads upon them, and the blood of the grapes rises up to the horse's bridle. This is the Most High's judgment, and he will bring it to pass. Who is his target? Who is he focused on in this judgment? According to this passage, Esau, Edom. How does he tread? In fury. So we've begun YAHUAH chapter 63, and we still have plenty more to discuss regarding this chapter. And so we're going to end this lesson here and pick up on part 2 of this lesson at another time. We're going to continue to read about the Most High's judgment on Esau, Edom, and his task of bringing judgment to the nation of Edom. So we'll pick up on this at another time and continue this lesson. And I pray that you'll join me as we complete this lesson. It was necessary that we talk about what had happened during the slave trade and how those who are Edomites have not abided by Torah and have misrepresented themselves and their position, even after the fact, saying, well, it wasn't so bad. I know they own slaves, but it wasn't so bad. Everybody was doing it. That's no excuse. When you have Torah and when you're supposed to be the people of the book, you've got to live by the book, whether it's easy or whether it's hard. And enslaving your brother and treating him in despiteful ways was anti-Torah then, and it's anti-Torah now. And the Most High Yahuwah is going to make a reckoning. A reckoning is coming. May the Most High Yahuwah Baruch and keep you, brothers and sisters. Bless and keep you. And may he make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May he lift up his countenance upon you and grant you shalom, peace in every area of life. Until next time, let us stay prayed up, let us stay repentant before the Most High, and let us continue to search ourselves and keep our garments white. Let's not allow hatred to enter our hearts. Until next time, shalom, shalom, brothers and sisters. Shalom, shalom.
Bye.